Hi, I'm Phil Craig.
And I'm Andrew Loney.
And together we aim to bring you the most scandalous stories and some of the most scandalous people in history. So thanks for joining us here on the Scandal Mongers podcast. Andrew, here we are again.
We are, and I think a very important podcast this time. Very important issue which very few people will really know about, but should know about.
Yeah, people in Australia, I think, will know about this. We have, thankfully, quite a few fans down there, but most people outside the country have never heard of this man, Ben Robert Smith, this war hero, who, well, it turns out, possibly has feet of clay.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic piece of journalism, and I'm really keen to hear how it was done. And I think also a very long legal case. So it sort of comes to through our theme of good investigative journalism being used to speak truth to power, basically.
I totally agree with that.
Because this man was backed by huge media organizations, and it must be a pretty frightening prospect to try and take him on.
Yep, in a minute we're going to be talking to my old friend Chris Masters, I'm very proud to call him that, about this extraordinary story of Ben Robert Smith. I want to do my update. Can I do my update, please?
Yes. I'm always intrigued to hear what people have to say about us.
Well, first of all, we are over 900 in our endless quest to get people.
Great.
We want people to subscribe on YouTube, even if you don't listen to us on YouTube, because once we get to 1,000, it really does change the game for us. And we're now at 902. So that's
great.
Good.
Well, let's hope just that final little bit, because as Phil says, this will allow us to do a lot more. Perhaps even go into a studio one day.
Oh, that'd be nice. I haven't done that for a while. But I'm afraid we've had our first really bad review, a real stinker. Are you feeling psychologically strong, Andrew?
Yes, I haven't read it yet. So,
well, I'm afraid this shook me. It shook me to the core. A lot of people said very nice things about the program last week with William Dalrymple. But I'm afraid somebody on TikTok said, listening to these men makes me think of unclipped nose hair and stained corduroy trousers.
Well, here we are in shirt sleeves. I have no facial growth.
Well, I don't know. Anybody want to have a look? No, let's not go there. But
I think they should just go to
anyway,
Spotify.
Look, I'm showing the audience now. This is X-rated, age-appropriate shorts for a gentleman of a certain age, not corduroy trousers.
Exactly.
And a cool Australian T-shirt. Anyway, look, sorry about that.
There was a bit of controversy. There was a certain amount of social media controversy about William Dalrymple, saying there's more to the story than perhaps he presents, which we've always said. We like to present lots of different points of view.
Indeed.
But in some ways, we'd like to just drop in and drop out of subjects. There's so many we want to cover. And we can't get into the nitty-gritty sometimes of some of these debates.
That's right. Well, Chris Masters, very quickly, for people who don't know Chris, he's a legend in the world of Australian journalism. I was lucky enough to work with him when I lived and worked for the ABC, the national broadcaster there. But even I didn't quite understand what a big deal he is. This is a true story. We didn't meet to his house. We'd met him and his family and had barbecues there. But then we were in Melbourne at a museum of media and history. And there's like a whole wing of this museum dedicated to Chris, because he'd made some incredible programs, one of which in the late 80s literally brought down the government of Queensland, the entire state. So he's a serious player. And this story he's investigated about these alleged war crimes. And we should say, it's a legal process. As you'll hear, he won a case that was brought against him. There might be an appeal. So he's going to report what he believes to be true and what a judge believed was the case in a civil court. But this case has attracted attention from other militaries too. The British, apparently, have been looking closely because there are allegations special forces in Afghanistan went way too far from multiple countries.
Well, it's been a big question, as you say. I remember as an agent covering a couple of these stories, and I know the Mail came very close to running a story about this. Very hard sometimes to prove, but I think certainly if there are bad apples, I think the army wants to root them out because it's bad for their moral authority, and it's bad, I think, in practical terms. How can you win the hearts and minds of people if you're shooting them quite unnecessarily?
Quite agree. Well, I think that's probably all people need to know. What do you say, Andrew?
I think we've set it up, and I think Chris will probably take us through very, very lucidly.
I'm sure he will. All right. I do apologize for showing my knees. Here we go to Chris. Speak to you soon. Well, thank you for joining us, Chris. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well too. I was just telling Andrew of your elevated role in the pantheon of Australian journalism. So I hope your ears were burning. But on a more personal level, and it's a great Australian story for me, I think the first time you cooked me a barbecue, and you're as good a barbecuer as you are a reporter, you told me not to wander too much down the driveway because earlier that day you'd seen some death adders.
Death adders, yes. Yeah. No, we have them on our block. They're pretty fearsome. I haven't seen one for a while, but one time we actually had a soldier, a veteran from Afghanistan here. And, whereas in Afghanistan, he had a terrific eye for the IEDs that were sown, the roadside bombs. He developed a talent for it. Indeed, he got blown up on one occasion. Here in Australia, I've got an eye for the death adders. I watch out for them because they're sneaky little buggers. Mm-hmm. And anyway, I spotted one on the path, and he got a hell of a fright. And he emailed me the next day and said he was suffering from post-traumatic death adder disorder.
Well, that's a very Australian story. And let's get into the more serious one, which is this remarkable, and congratulations, by the way, on what happened in court. A lot of our listeners won't know much about the story. Could you just kind of give us a very brief intro to who this guy is and how he first became the subject of public attention, I suppose?
Yes, well, he's almost literally larger than life, 7 foot tall and bulletproof. The Anzac legend come to life. Ben Robert Smith, VCMG, the most decorated living soldier in Australia, the son of a judge and a major general, not the classic Charles Bean, Aussie digger from the bush, private school educated, came from an elite Perth family. And then had the silver bullet ride. He not only returned from Afghanistan, our most decorated soldier, but he was then mentored by one of Australia's billionaires, Kerry Stokes, a media magnate. He runs the Seven network. And so Ben Robert Smith was then catapulted from humble corporal to managing director of the Seven network in Queensland. So, his influence reached well beyond his military career.
And when did people first begin to think that this hero may have feet of clay?
Well, within the SAS, he was a controversial figure, a divisive figure. But as you know, it's a secretive institution. So those secrets didn't leak out. I mean, to some degree, there were hints of it, even when it was announced that someone was to receive a Victoria Cross. There was a story in the paper saying they understood that it was going to go to this renowned bully. And I think that, he got his first medal, the Medal for Gallantry, after an action in 2006, then the Victoria Cross in 2010, and then another medal, leadership medal, Commendation for Distinguished Service in 2012. By 2013, soldiers in Perth were beginning to complain, and in Canberra, the headquarters of the Australian Defence Force, the rumours began to circulate, essentially among the chaplains, who heard a lot, the psychologists who probably heard much more, to some degree the intel staff. But you would characterise it all as rumour. I mean, I heard a lot of it, but in the early stages, it wasn't so much characterised as war crimes, but stories of a bullying individual who was disliked and was held responsible for the trashing of young soldiers' careers. They were pretty slow to invoke war crimes because, of course, bad publicity affected them all. So I think they pretty much held back from that. But then I think the rumours got so hot that in around about 2015, the the Defence Force decided to have an inquiry, an independent inquiry, the Inspector General's inquiry, run by another Major General and a Supreme Court judge, Paul Brereton. And that's when the rumours began to harden into fact. And of course, at that same time, I was writing a book. It was the only book that's really been written on Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan. And I began to hear some of those rumours too. It wasn't until about 2017 that I began to learn of the first evidence of war crimes, alleged war crimes. And it's only now in the last month that long battle has, at this stage anyway, been resolved.
I mean, some people listening to this who don't know you as well as I do might think, oh, who is this left-wing, agitating hack journalist who's trying to tear down the military? Typical whinging kind of pinko liberal. And I just think we should explain before we go any further that you've written lots of books and done lots of work with the army, and you're in no way that caricature.
No, well, thank you for that. And I think there's a great irony here. In journalism, we tend to think that the purest form of the trade is conducted outside the tent, the guerrilla journalist, rather than the journalist who was in the press pack or being led around by the nose by a military public affairs officer. I mean, I embedded 3 times in Afghanistan with the ADF. The last time with Special Forces, which was absolutely remarkable. They would not let journalists anywhere near them. And clearly they did on this occasion because they trusted me. And I suppose they trusted me for a good reason, and that is that I pretty much trusted them. To be honest with you, Phil, I really, I couldn't say I'm absolutely shocked that I learned that Australians were responsible for war crimes, but I didn't see it in the national character. I sort of held to a rather romantic view that there was something in the national character that suited the peacekeeping role. We like to think of ourselves as tough and fair. And I worked with the Australian soldiers. I went out on patrol with them. I recognised that courageous restraint. I'd done a lot of work with Australian soldiers over the years. I was in Rwanda and I saw that courageous restraint again. In Somalia, I saw them protecting the innocent. In East Timor, I remember a family coming up to me and saying, "Your soldiers are so wonderful." The Indonesian soldiers, they use their uniforms to pillage and do worse. But your soldiers are here to protect us. We're astonished. So I had a rather comfortable view of them. I used to say to them, look, if I see anything and hear anything that's in the public interest that's not necessarily in your interest, I won't report it. But I don't think I actually thought it would ever happen. And so the irony comes in the fact that it was because I was inside the tent and I was trusted and they knew I wasn't a scandal monger and out to tear them down that they began to confide in me.
That's really interesting. Andrew, while you were away, sorry, you're having your normal technical problems.
Cut.
Well, Chris was just explaining how the story first emerged really through rumours of bullying, which then became stories of alleged war crimes. And then I guess you got involved, Chris. Were you driving this investigation, or are you mostly reporting it, or a mixture of the two?
Well, I was a reporter on the ABC Four Corners program, the same as your Panorama program. In fact, I had the longest run of anybody. I was there for 25 years. But in 2009, I pretty much left. At that stage, I'd done a couple of reports from Afghanistan, and one of them, where the 2 soldiers who were right beside me, slept beside them that night. They were killed that day when we were out on patrol. So, if you like, I was kind of emotionally connected too, because I felt that, unlike many civilians, I actually knew what it was like to come home and kiss my wife and cuddle my grandkids, whereas they would never come home again. They would never have grandkids. So I had an unusual commitment, I think. But anyway, that led to me writing some books, and the No Front Line book was the big account of the 12 odd years that Australia operated in Afghanistan, our longest war, as we call it, probably the same with you. I guess not. But anyway, it was in the course of doing the No Front Line book, right at the final stages of it, frankly, that I began to hear stories of war crimes. It was pretty hard to put them in the book. Some of them went in, but I got straight away involved in a rather tortured court battle, which meant that there was a lot of limits to what I said. But I teamed with a colleague. I'd long worked with a much younger reporter, Nick McKenzie, who was, the Trump investigative reporter at the Age newspaper. And I said to Nick in 2017, look, there's a big story here. So from 2018 onwards, we pursued it, got to a point mid-2018 that we had enough to publish. But of course, that caused a firestorm. It's a very hard story to tell. A war hero is exposed as war criminal. It's not only hard to stack up with the facts and extracting them from a very secretive community and dealing with the fact that, Afghanistan was an impossible scenario. You couldn't really go there and dig up evidence. And then add that to the fact that it wasn't really a story that the Australian public was too eager to hear. We love our heroes. We love our Anzac heroes in particular. So Nick and I absolutely copped it for a couple of years. It was a very brave act on the part of the Age newspaper and the Sydney Morning Herald, since taken over by the Nine network. But I think one of the great calls in the history of the news industry that they did what we were supposed to do. I think I'd like to think that our role is sometimes to challenge the public, and that's the most responsible thing that we can do. We definitely got into a brawl with the billionaire media proprietor, Kerry Stokes, who, of course, ran the rival network, the Seven network, and Brendan Nelson, the head of the Australian War Memorial, Dr. Brendan Nelson, now based in London at Boeing. He took up the cudgels very much for Ben Roberts-Smith and was commonly in the news lamenting, where is the public interest in tearing down our heroes? And so I felt we were kind of in a no man's land in a way. The Sacred Digger Can Do No Wrong story is the story that resonates in Australia. Australia is very attached to its limited military history. The Anzac tradition, it's almost like a secular religion. The Anzac Day is a kind of a national day. So I think it was very hard for people to accept that that myth, it was indeed myth, not based on very much fact at all.
Shall we a little bit of some of the detail that came out? I was just doing a little bit of background research for the interview today, and I'd not heard of this Spartan killing, for example, or blooding the rookies. It seems that Robert Smith, at least he's alleged to have created almost like a sort of warrior cult around himself. Is there any of that you can share with us now?
When I first learned of war crimes, they fell into three categories. The first was what we called what you call in, say, policing loading. That is sort of placing a weapon on a person to make out that they've been involved in criminality. So this sort of thing was going on in Afghanistan. They were routinely taking into field implements there was a Russian pistol called the Makarov, and the magic Makarov kept turning up on corpses, and mostly they would use an ICOM radio, a little handheld radio, indicated that somebody was probably involved in combat, and so this business of planting weapons on people was common. as was blooding. Now, interesting for your audience, there's a strong theory that the blooding came out of 22 Squadron SAS or SBS, and to some degree Northern Ireland. I think Andrew Urban wrote that book, Big Boys Rules, where, the feeling was that you just didn't leave a combatant alive on the battlefield because the justice system was too slow and inefficient. And if you didn't knock them off then, they'd come and knock you off later. So that secret deal, it seemed to be struck in some quarters of special forces. I think beyond the Australians, frankly, that it wasn't wise to leave a combatant alive. So there was an ex-British SBS patrol commander who was Robert Smith's superior. And in the court case, he gave evidence, and he was commonly accused by some of the other soldiers of having this practice of what he called blooding the rookie, and a couple of those rookies ended up giving evidence in court. He of course denied that expression was ever used. But I mean, one of the interesting twists in the court case was that we had to go through the evidence in fine detail, and a lot of it was photographic evidence, and we found a sign on the patrol room door that used the word rookie. When actually there was a profanity added to that, but they were denying that it was ever used, but there it was in black and white.
So this is effective. This effectively is executing injured prisoners and getting a younger member to do it, so they're now part of the gang.
And what upset the soldiers who spoke against Robert Smith was not so much the execution of unarmed prisoners who represented no threat at all, but rather the fact that he was bullying young soldiers into doing it because, getting a first kill they thought was important. And they were right, because these soldiers would come back from war not feeling triumphant and victorious, not feeling proud of themselves at all. If the last image they had was a terrified Afghan on his knees about to have his brains blown out, it's not why they joined the Australian Defence Force. And a lot of them had a lot of trouble when they came back, a lot of psychological injury. And indeed, it was that worried so many soldiers that I think motivated them into ultimately speaking up. Of course, more so horrible for the Afghans who were murdered in the way they were. Some of the soldiers, many people would continue to say, well, so what? They were combatants, but even that wasn't necessarily true. Well, certainly under the rules of engagement, it's wrong for any of us to be murdering prisoners. We certainly thought so when the Nazis did it. We certainly thought so when the Japanese did it. So why is it okay if you've got an Australian uniform on? But I have to say that the most notorious incident of all, which is the Spartan kicking that you referred to, that fellow wasn't a combatant at all. He was an innocent Afghan who'd come from another village to buy flour and some shoes for his kids. It was a very, very unlucky day for him. Essentially, when they came into these villages and they had an Afghan partner force with them, the Afghans would have a good idea who were the locals and who weren't. And if you weren't a local, there was an assumption that you were probably Taliban. A lot of times that might be right, but it wasn't right in this case. The guy was from a neighbouring village, and he got caught up in it. Robert Smith was infuriated by him as the evidence was divulged in court. It seemed like his biggest crime was that he smiled at Robert Smith, or rather laughed. And he got kicked off a cliff and then in an appallingly cruel way executed below.
Gosh. And does Robert Smith accept that he did these things but says that they were justified, or does he deny doing these things?
No, he absolutely denies it. He wasn't there for the judgment day. He was there for the other 110 days in court. But when the ruling finally came down, much to the surprise of Nick McKenzie and myself, he didn't show up. And then we learned that he was sunning himself in Bali on that day. Then he went to New Zealand, he hung out with a friend, another one of the soldiers who was with him, the one that the court revealed decked out in a Ku Klux Klan outfit at one of their, dress-up party days. When Robert Smith finally came back to Australia, he absolutely denied that anything, he said he had nothing to apologise for. The court had got it horrendously wrong, and, they're considering an appeal right now.
Gosh, it must have been, I don't know, Andrew, I don't know if you know Andrew. Can you hear us, Andrew? I know you're having technical...
Yes, I can. Yes. No, I'm just listening, fascinated by the story, because, of course, there's certain sort of parallels with what's been happening in Britain, too. But, yes, no, I'm fascinated to see the repercussions.
Well, defamation, of course, Andrew has been doing some amazing digging into all sorts of stories and risking the attention of lawyers. It's a scary thing to be sued, but, I mean, it must be even scarier when one of Australia's richest tycoons has written a blank cheque to the man who's taking you to court. That must have been terrifying, Chris.
Well, I think that Robert Smith probably thought he was going to win because he thought the game was about power rather than truth. I think he'd always felt that. He's an imposing figure. He's a large man. He used his size to intimidate others. He used his family connections to intimidate the officer corps. And when the grumblings first began, in fact, with me, he lawyered up straight away. I always felt that if he didn't, if he played it cool and basically said, look, Chris, who cares? Soldiers always have different accounts of what goes on in combat. No big deal. I don't, if he'd professed no real antipathy towards those other soldiers, this might well have all gone away. But no, he lawyered up. We ended up having 3 senior counsel against us. It's unprecedented. The legal bills ran to about $25 million. And the court case itself ran 110 days. And this was all over about a 5-year period. I mean, COVID obviously slowed it down quite a lot. I'd have to say, frankly, to our advantage. I wonder whether in the beginning, we might have prevailed because the evidence required to satisfy the editors that we had a story that we could defend is nothing like the evidence that is required to actually defend it in court over 110 days. They were intent on tearing our witnesses apart. They didn't think that the Afghan witnesses would be believed, that, they would be dismissed as being pro-Taliban. But I think that the court environment and the barracks room environment are very different places. I think in the barracks room, he managed to get away with it because he was a bully, his power prevailed. But in the courtroom, in the cool, calm, collected light of truth, he struggled. And even though our witnesses did not want to be there, these are SAS people, they're never in the limelight, and they don't want to speak against their mates either, who were supposed to have their back. So none of them wanted to be there. And in a sense, I think our witnesses had peak credibility because they didn't want to be there, because there was no real motive for them to be getting in the box and telling lies. They came across very well. We had 20 witnesses. I mean, Nick McKenzie and I are being criticised quite a lot for scandal mongering, etc. People seem to forget that the actual allegations didn't come from us initially, but rather from his fellow soldiers, something like 20 of them. He assembled a similar number of soldiers. Basically, it felt in the beginning like it was a numbers game, that, if we could find 10 people who said war crimes occurred, they'd find 20 who said they didn't occur. And there were a lot of soldiers, and probably still are a lot of soldiers, that think that not ratting against your mate is more important than exposing war crimes. However, I mean, oh, what a tangled web. You know, if you start telling lies, you'll get caught out in a courtroom environment. And Justice Pisanko ended up bringing down a 700-page judgment, which, you know, I'd invite you to read, although it'll take you a week. But it's an exceptionally good judgment in my view.
Gosh, well, you know, like I say, it must have been such high pressure, and we're just so full of admiration for what you achieved there, Chris. I mean, I guess there is one argument which I should at least air, because some people will think it. You know, there is a long tradition of these kind of allegations, proven otherwise, in all wars. One thing's a break of Morant in terms of Australian military history. You know, the old rule 303: get rid of people quietly, nobody needs to know. And you know, is there an argument that it's wrong to apply kind of civilian values of justice to a environment that is chaotic and violent and deadly, like a war zone? I mean, I'm sure I'm not the first person to say this to you, but I'm sure you've got a really good answer. But
well, I mean, it is wrong. The army says it's wrong. The rules of engagement say we don't murder prisoners. We still signatories to the Geneva Convention. I think in a brutal war of survival, you know, horrible things happen all the time. But let's be clear, none of the incidents that we looked at were fog of war incidents. They weren't heat of the moment matters. They were cool, calculated killings. And as I said before, we certainly didn't think that the Nazis were right to line up civilians against a wall and shoot them. And perhaps even more so in these small wars where it's very hard to find a metric for success. The most important measure is moral authority. We actually have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. Standards really matter. And it's not only a moral issue, it's also a strategic one. Every time they went into one of those villages and they killed an innocent farmer, they created 10 more Taliban. It was actually strategically counterproductive as well. And let me say, these soldiers themselves were offended. I mean, there's a lot of human wreckage now. The soldiers who are persuaded to do the wrong thing, they have to live with their consciences, and many of them can't. They didn't join the ADF and sign up to that proud tradition of Australian soldiering to come back and feel miserable. I believe, unromantically, I hope, that the great majority of the soldiers over there weren't like that at all. They were extremely offended by this brutal, thuggish behaviour that did get out of control in some areas of special forces, because they do have privileges that the common soldiers don't have. They have a high degree of autonomy, and now, you know, largely through popular fiction, etc., they're being celebrated as kind of superheroes. There are so many movies around about sort of superhero special forces people. I think in Australia, one of the problems was they began to believe their own bullshit.
Brilliant.
And has this brought forward other people, other stories? People feel more confident about speaking out now because of this case in your investigations?
I hope so. I mean, it's still difficult. I mean, I think the benefit of this win we had before the courts is that there'll be fewer Ben Robert Smiths in the future. The Ben Robert Smith factor goes into the lexicon, but it still took 5 years and $12 million or something to succeed with this story. So, you know, I think that there's a deterrent still within the industry to doing tough investigative journalism. And of course, it never gets easier for the witnesses. But I'm glad that we can demonstrate that we have got an independent judiciary in Australia, that the nation is prepared to handle the truth, because there has been a lot of nonsense about the Anzac myth over the years that perhaps makes things dangerous for us. We can't overestimate ourselves. We can't believe that we have this martial prowess that indeed we don't have if we're not well trained and not well resourced. Following the court case, following the Inspector General's inquiry, there now is a newly appointed Office of the Special Investigator, and they're looking at something like 25 incidents of alleged war crimes from Afghanistan. I think it's important that we come to terms with what actually happened. And for what it's worth, I understand that British investigators have been here as well, shadowing the work of the Inspector General and picking up on whatever intelligence might be useful to their inquiries.
Gosh, and did you ever feel at any point that this wasn't going to work out as you'd hoped? And did you have pressure put on you outside the courtroom?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a telling comment of investigative journalism that one of our least worries is the death threats. They become routine, and you sort of don't even notice them after a while. But we got a lot of them, and I think that unfortunately, in that kind of digger diaspora, the sort of soldiers and their wannabe hangers on, we were seen as heretics. How dare we take on the sacred soldier? And probably the thing that was hardest for us, frankly, was being attacked by our own colleagues. It became also a media war. The Kerry Stokes, the arch defender of Ben Roberts-Smith, is the head of the Seven Network, and the Nine, his competitor, where we worked, its principal rival is the Murdoch Press, and so Nick Mackenzie and I woke up day after day after day to attacks from the Murdoch Press about our journalism. That was pretty hard to take.
Is there another stage coming, Chris, or can you see an end to it now?
Well, you finish what you start, and I'll probably be dead by the time this one finishes. It will go on. Robert Smith could well appeal. He's looking into an appeal right now. Beyond that, of course, there is the likelihood of criminal charges. In a civil court, a justice determined that 4 murders had occurred. Beyond that, there was a lot of evidence that emerged through the court of witness intimidation that'll probably also find its way, I would have imagined, to a criminal court. And as I mentioned, the Office of the Special Investigator has been doing some widespread investigations in the direction of Robert Smith and beyond, to other Special Forces soldiers. The Four Corners program ran a report about 2 years back now where that we actually had helmet cam vision of an Afghan being evidently executed in the field. He doesn't appear to have any kind of weapons, and a soldier stands over him with an M4 rifle and yells out to the men behind, do you want me to drop this C? And eventually does. The world has seen that. So, and I think that woke up a lot of people. When we were reporting in print, essentially, people read the words, but there was something really rather extraordinary in seeing it for yourself. And I think that turned a corner somewhat when that helmet cam vision was revealed. But still in all, to this day, there are lots of people that deny that and there was any wrongdoing, despite this evidence.
Well, we're getting out to the end of our little allotted Zoom time. Andrew and I have been lucky to have some great journalists on our little podcast so far, but I'm not sure anybody has taken on quite the burden that you did and the risks that you did. And it's incredibly to your credit. And anybody who's listening or watching, Chris's books are really worth your time, and we'll put a link up to that too in the little podcast. And thank you.
It's a powerful story. It shows you the power of a journalist. I mean, it's, I take my hat off to you. Absolutely. Because it's a long period to sustain an investigation.
Yes, it was reassuring. We talk about speaking truth to power, and in fact, I think that pretty much describes the contest. On the other side, they thought that power would win. On our side, we had to believe that truth would win, and so far, we got a win. You never feel like you've really won in a defamation action. It's there are lots of losers, but I know that I would feel a hell of a lot worse if we hadn't got that judgment.
Well, thanks again for your time, Chris, and good luck with both the death threats and the death adders.
Good on you, mate. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. Good luck.
Thank you for listening to the Scandal Mongers podcast. This has been a Podcast World production. You can get in contact with our show by emailing team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandal Mongers in the heading, or via our social media links within the show's bio.